Again, I want to say thank you very much for coming and joining us. I have my own relatively short little reflection. And the thing I've been thinking about a lot these past couple of weeks is accountability. That's the word that's been in my brain. That's the thing that I've been sort of holding on to, is who is accountable? Who am I accountable to? Who are the people in my community? How are they accountable to me? And, you know, this past week, we had Indigenous Peoples Day. We had people arguing about whether it should be Indigenous Peoples Day or also Columbus Day at the same time. You know, and we keep going about, you know, who are we accountable to? Are we accountable to the Indigenous people who say this is their land and that we should honor their ancestors? Are we accountable to the history we've created about Christopher Columbus, which really, that's not even what all of this is about. It's just the idea of, as time goes on, accountability is what I think about when I think about climate justice, environmental justice, the climate emergency. And so I also want to say that 2 years ago, this is not what I was doing. 2 years ago, and even before then, I was spending a lot of time doing racial justice work. I was spending a lot of time on the internet talking about books by Black authors and spending a lot of time using my voice and my platform to advocate for carrying the stories of Black writers. And I don't really remember the complete pivot in that, but as I became an on-the-ground activist here in LA, I started to learn a little bit more about the disparages between, say, people who are unhoused, whether they are white or Black or people of color, and the disparages between the publishing world, if you're white or Black or a person of color. And the thing that hit me really hard, right, is if you know anything about the climate emergency and environmental justice, right, you find that the pollutants of the world, of our area, lie in places that are mostly brown and Black people. You know, and Jolly talked a little bit about the generating station that I had never heard of until about a year or two ago, right? The first time I had heard about it was we're gonna go stand in front of it and protest it. We're gonna go stand and protest in front of a thing that I didn't even know existed until now. And so then I think about what I am accountable for and who I'm accountable to. I think about the platform that I had, that I could talk to people about books and then pivot just a little bit to be able to talk about environmental justice. I took a few workshops and I learned a lot about both the way in which pollutants show up, the very scientific way that the globe is warming, the very intense way that science talks about it. And then I ended up in people's communities where they would say, you know what, most people here have asthma. You know what, it's hotter here because there's less trees. You know, and I learned that the time that I spent learning all the scientific things didn't help me be accountable to the people who needed help immediately. And so I think about all of this and I think, well, what can we do? How can I bring people aboard? What is the part here that gets you to go, okay, I'm gonna go home and I'm gonna be accountable? And part of that is taking ownership, right? It's not just saying that the environment is important to save. It's not just putting on workshops and sermons to say, this is the spot where my values line up, right? It's being accountable and taking ownership for the thing. And so now, in a very weird turn of events, and one of the scariest times any of us have been in, right? my former self would not recognize me. I have gone to Line 3 and provided care and service to people fighting against Line 3. I have shown up at protesters and march, and I have given sermons and speeches. I have blocked traffic for the climate. And that is a very different person than I was 2 or 3 years ago, because I had to decide where was my line of ownership. What did I have to do to take claim and ownership of something that is not actually just my fault? Very little of what's killing the planet is my fault. Very little of it is your fault. But we have found that we have to take ownership together, because that is how we get things done. And I'll give you an example of Line 3 specifically. I was in Minnesota for a week. And for a few of those days, I stayed at a camp. And there were people at the camp who did dishes and cooked food for everyone who stayed there. And there were people who did security and watched out and made sure that we were all safe. And there were people who were off doing frontline work, chaining themselves to bulldozers. And I didn't have to be all of those people, right? I had to be in that community, taking ownership for the peace that people asked of me. And together, we did a really important and somewhat dangerous thing, because that was what was important. And so when we talk about ownership and accountability, we cannot do it alone, because it's not our fault to take on one by one. Raduca talked about burning out as an activist. I've been there. It's hard. When you're a frontline activist, that is hard. David talked about doing civic engagement and getting people involved so that they could make changes on a governmental level. Daniel also talked about that, right? Because it takes all of these pieces. I would not be able to stand up here if my kids didn't hang out at After School Village for half of their week, right? And so ownership is also building your community so that there are people who are fighting this fight with you. And so I would like to say, get out there and protest if you can. Start a community meeting so that people can talk about what changes need to be made. Attend mutual aid projects like gardening, childcare, services. Support local teachers and educators as they build a line of defense for the next generation. Because we can't do it alone. And so I ask, as I stand here and say, I am accountable to you, can you be accountable to me so that we can work together and make the changes that we need? Because that's really how difference happens. And so thank you again for joining me, for joining us tonight, because this is not about me or Jolly or the church. This is about us being in a place together and saying that my religion is against fossil fuels and big oil, and destroying the planet is not what I'm for. Thank you so much.